we had a really in-depth conversation when we were meeting to plan this event out, and I knew immediately that he was someone who was passionate about A, helping people, and B, doing what it takes to help individuals who are helping people. And that falls right in line with what I'm all about. So yes, I found a new friend. So with that being said, as Nick highlighted my background, one of the things that I want to share that wasn't included is that I am a Southerner through and through. We were talking about that before we got started. I have had the opportunity to visit the Philadelphia metro area, and had a great time there, by the way. But being who I am, being the son of a pastor, being someone who is dedicated to helping kids, adults, to working through the field of counseling, mental health counseling, and school counseling, I weave my experiences as a practitioner, as an educator, but also as an African-American man in the United States into everything that I do. And so with that being said, I wanted to give you sort of a heads up as to my approach to sharing some of the information that I have here for you this evening. I work and live by the motto that what is personal is professional, and what is professional for me is very personal. And so as a result of that, I will weave my own personal experiences, both personally and professionally, into this session in hopes that it drives home the content session. I am somewhat new to presenting virtually. I think we all are. So I ask that you bear with me as we work through the next 90 minutes or so. All right, so with that being said, I'm going to attempt to share my screen, and then we will get going, okay? Give me just one moment here. Let's see. Well, that didn't work. Let's see. Let's go here. And okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, great, great. So, as the title suggests, we are always, we should always be in the pursuit of justice, equity, and equality in this country. It's what many of our founding principles here in the United States rest upon. And so one of the things in my own experiences in the United States Air Force, my experiences growing up in rural Alabama, my experiences traveling the world as a member of the Air Force, living in the Midwest, visiting all parts of this country, I know that we've got work to do, okay? And I cannot even start this presentation without acknowledging what is currently going on in our country with regards to the most recent event involving an African-American male and the police. And I think most of you are aware of what's going on in, I think it's pronounced Kenosha, Wisconsin, where the gentleman was shot in the back a number of times, 7 or 8 times or something like that. And so this topic, reducing implicit bias, is connected to even that experience. And I hope that some of the things that I share here this evening will help you make those connections so that we can start doing the work that we have to do individually so that we can then positively impact A, our homes, B, our communities, our cities, our states, and the whole country. All right, so with that being said, let's get started. The goals or the objectives for this evening, pretty simple, pretty simple. I like to keep it simple. It's a holdover from my training in the Air Force, where, get directly to the point. And so My hope this evening is that you'll be able to define and gain an understanding of implicit bias within various aspects of our society. Secondly, that you'll be able to identify how implicit bias negatively impacts people within various institutions of our society. I'll go into very specific detail about that. And then finally, the hope or the objective is that you will be able to identify strategies for reducing implicit bias. And so that's the premise we're going to work from here this evening. One of the first things we have to do is define what it is. And I've been a really big fan of the TED Talk series over the last few years. And I came across this one TED Talk about 6 years ago, and I reached out to the individual. Her name was Verna Myers. And so she did a TED Talk specifically on implicit bias after the shooting death of Michael Brown in St. Louis, Missouri. And so to sort of get us started, I'd like to play the first 6 minutes of that TED Talk because I think it's a great introduction and will allow us to transition seamlessly into some of the content that I have for you. So I'm going to try and do this as well. Let's see. Okay, can you all see the screen?
It's on a long road trip.
Uh-oh.
We can't see yours. If you do, Dr. Crook, there, now I can see it.
Gotcha. Here we go.
Awesome.
Yeah, here we go. Let's see here.
Summer.
Can everyone?
And I was having a wonderful time listening to the amazing Isabella Wilkerson's Warmth of Other Suns. It documents 6 million Black folks fleeing the South from 1915 to 1970, looking for a respite from all the brutality and trying to get to a better opportunity up north. And it was filled with stories of the resilience and the brilliance of African Americans. And it was also really hard to hear all the stories of the horrors and the humility and all of the humiliations. It was especially hard to hear about the beatings and the burnings and the lynchings of Black men. And I said, you know, this is a little deep. I need a break. I'm going to turn on the radio. I turned it on and there it was. Ferguson, Missouri. Michael Brown. 18-year-old Black man, unarmed, shot by a white police officer, laid on the ground, dead, blood running for 4 hours while his grandmother and little children and his neighbors watched in horror. And I thought, here it is again. This violence, this brutality against Black men has been going on for centuries. I mean, it's the same story. It's just different names. I mean, it could have been Amadou Diallo. It could have been Sean Bell. It could have been Oscar Grant. It could have been Trayvon Martin. This violence, this brutality is really something that's part of our national psyche. It's part of our collective history. What are we going to do about it? You know, that part of us that still crosses the street, locks the doors, clutches the purses when we see young Black men, that part. I mean, I know we're not shooting people down in the street, but I'm saying that the same stereotypes and prejudices that fuel those kinds of tragic incidents are in us. We've been schooled in them as well. I believe that we can stop these types of incidents, these Fergusons, from happening by looking within and being willing to change ourselves. So I have a call to action for you. there are 3 things that I want to offer us today to think about as ways to stop Ferguson from happening again. 3 things that I think will help us reform our images of young Black men. 3 things that I'm hoping will not only protect them, but will open the world so that they can thrive. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine our country embracing young Black men, seeing them as part of our future, giving them that kind of openness, that kind of grace we give to people we love? How much better would our lives be? How much better would our country be? Let me just start with number 1. We got to get out of denial. We don't need, stop trying to be good people. We need real people. You know, I do a lot of diversity work, and people will come up to me at the beginning of a workshop. They're like, "Oh, Miss Diversity Lady, we're so glad you're here. But we don't have a bias bone in our body." And I'm like, really? Because I do this work every day and I see all my biases. I mean, not too long ago, I was on a plane and I heard the voice of a women pilot coming over the PA system, and I was just like so excited. I was so thrilled. I was like, yes, women, we are rocking it. We are now in the stratosphere, you know? It was all good. And then it started getting turbulent and bumpy. And I was like, I hope she can drive. I know, right, but it is not even like I knew that was a bias until I was coming back on the other leg. There's always a guy driving, and it's often turbulent and bumpy, and I've never questioned the competence of the male driver. The pilot, it's good. Now here's the problem. It's like, if you ask me explicitly, I would say, female pilot, awesome. But it appears that when things get funky and a little troublesome, a little risky, I lean on a bias that I didn't even know that I had. You know, fast moving planes in the sky, I want a guy. Mm-hmm. That's my default. Men are my default. Who is your default? Who do you trust? Who are you afraid of? Who do you implicitly feel connected to? Who do you run away from? I'm going to tell you what we have learned. The implicit association test, which measures unconscious bias. You can go online and take it. 5 million people have taken it. Turns out our default is white. We like white people. We prefer white. What do I mean by that? When people are shown images of Black men and white men, we are more quickly able to associate that picture with a positive word, that white person with a positive word, than we are when we are trying to associate positive with a Black face. And vice versa. When we see a Black face, it's easier for us to connect Black with negative than it is white with negative. 70% of white people taking that test prefer white. 50% of Black people taking that test prefer white. You see, we were all outside when the contamination came down. What do we do about the fact that our brain automatically associates? You know, one of the things that you probably are thinking about, you're probably like, you know what? I'm just gonna double down on my color blindness. Yes, I'm going to recommit to that. I'm going to suggest to you, no, we've gone about as far as we can go trying to make a difference, trying to not see color. The problem was never that we saw color. It was what we did when we saw the color. It's a false ideal. And while we're busy pretending not to see, we are not being aware of the ways in which racial difference is changing people's possibilities. Mm-hmm. That's keeping them from thriving, and sometimes it's causing them an early death. So, in fact, what the scientists are telling us is it's no way. Don't even think about colorblindness. In fact, what they're suggesting is stare at awesome Black people. Look at them directly in their faces and memorize them, because when we look at awesome folks who are Black, it helps to dissociate the association that happens automatically in our brain. Why do you think I'm showing you these beautiful Black men behind me? There were not enough, there were so many, I had to cut them. Okay, so here's the thing. I'm trying to reset your automatic associations about who Black men are. I'm trying to remind you that young Black men grow up to be amazing human beings who have changed our lives and made them better. So here's the thing. The other possibility inside, and it's only temporarily changing our automatic assumptions, but one thing we know is that if you take a white person who is like odious, that you know, and stick it up next to a person of color, a Black person who's fabulous, then that sometimes actually causes us to disassociate too. So, you know, think like Jeffrey Dahmer and Colin Powell, like just stare at them, right? But these are the things. So go looking for your bias. Please, please just get out of denial and go looking for disconfirming data that will prove that, in fact, your old stereotypes are wrong. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, what I'm going to say is move toward young Black men instead of away from them. And, you know, it's not the hardest thing to do, but it's also... It's one of these things where you have to be conscious and intentional about it. You know, I was on a Wall Street area one time, like maybe several years ago, and I was with a colleague of mine, and she's really wonderful, and she does diversity work with me, and she's a woman of color, she's Korean, and we were outside, it was late at night, and we were sort of wondering where we're going, we were lost, and I saw this person across the street, and I was thinking, oh, great Black guy. You know, I was going toward him without even thinking about it. And she was like, oh, that's interesting. The guy across the street, you know, he was a Black guy. I think, you know, Black guys generally know where they're going. Like, I don't know why exactly I think that, but this is what I think. Okay, so she was saying, oh, you were going, yay, Black guy. She said, I was going, ooh, Black guy. Other direction, same need, same guy, same clothes, same time, same street. Different reaction. And she said, I feel so bad. I'm a diversity consultant. I did the Black guy thing. I'm a woman of color. Oh my God. And I said, you know what? Please, we really need to relax about this. I mean, you got to realize I go way back with Black guys. My dad is a Black guy. You see what I'm saying? I got a 6'5" Black guy son. I was married to a Black guy. My Black guy thing is so wide and so deep that I can pretty much sort and figure out who that Black guy is. And he was my Black guy. He said, yes, ladies, I know where you're going. I'll take you there. You know, biases are the stories we make up about people before we know who they actually are. But how are we going to know who they are when we've been told to avoid and be afraid of them? So,
all right. So I'm going to leave you on the cliffhanger and stop right there. After I watched this 17-minute TED Talk, I contacted Ms. Myers and asked her if I could use her TED Talk in every class that I taught. And she said, of course. And so I bring it in this evening based on one of her last sentences in that 6-minute clip that I just showed you. The stories we make up about people before we know who they are, that's what our implicit biases are. That's what they're alluding to. These are the things that we have to work to be able to identify, to acknowledge that they first exist. And so that's one of the definitions that I wanted to start us with here this evening as we move into more of the formal technical definitions that I've found in my research. But keep that line in mind, please. The stories we make up about people before we know who they are. Okay, thank you. All right, so is everybody with me? We're still good? Mm-hmm. Nod heads, thumbs up, good, great. So Again, I am the son of a Baptist pastor from the South. I grew up in the traditional African-American Christian church, and part of our culture is call and response. And so sometimes you will hear me ask questions or for affirmation. Please feel free to affirm as you are so moved to do so. All right. So it is okay with me. I just want to let y'all know that. All right. Before we get into those formal definitions, there are some important terms that we need to hash out because they're all directly connected to what biases are, both implicit and explicit. And the first one is our attitudes. And I have them listed here for you, but attitudes and stereotypes. So our attitude basically is something that an individual may favor or disfavor with regards to something or person based on our evaluation of that thing or person. So we have an attitude about something. For instance, I have an attitude about the vegetable okra. That is a very Southern staple. I'm not sure if you eat it in Pennsylvania, but I grew up, my family, I'm descended from individuals who grew up in rural Alabama, and okra was one of those vegetables that could easily be grown in your personal garden outside of your house. Well, my parents tried to get me to eat it, and I have a specific attitude towards okra based on my evaluation of it from when I was 5 years old. My wife thinks I'm ridiculous because I still have attitudes towards okra based on my experiences or my evaluation and judgment of that veggie way back when I was a little kid. I still won't eat the stuff. So, but that is my attitude towards that. Stereotypes, these ideas or inferences that we have about things, about people, about places, based on their assignment to a particular group. These are all terms that you all have heard of. I want to make sure that we operationally define them, though, as we move into this formal definition. Some additional terms: prejudice, discrimination, stigma. All right? A prejudice is this emotional thing that we have, this emotional reaction that we have, that we pull from our judgments and evaluations about people or even a group of people, all right, as a result of some of those stereotypes that we hold, right? Discrimination, of course, we all of us should be very familiar with that, especially if we work, in professional settings. But discrimination can occur when those negative behaviors, our negative behaviors, are aimed specifically at others due to those prejudices that we have and due to the stereotypes that we hold. Yeah. So you see how these terms are, we've known what they are, right? Everybody knows what they are in our day-to-day lives, but you see how they even build on one another. And then this stigma refers to I'll read the formal definition, a discrediting attribute that causes an individual or group to be perceived as inferior and less than human. Okay? Stigma about Black men led to many of the lynchings that took place early in the 20th century. Stigma about Japanese Americans led to their internment during World War II, okay? These are all things that we hold as people, as individuals in the human community, but more specifically, I'm nailing things down to what's going on right here in the United States, okay? So that leads us to a formal definition of implicit bias. And in my research, I found, of course, I found a lot of different scholarly definitions, and I found a trend, and I want to share the trend through three different definitions. The first, implicit bias refers to those actions or beliefs that are controlled by automatic evaluations outside of our awareness. Okay, that's that implicit piece. But I've highlighted here actions or beliefs, all right? Another definition refers to actions or judgments, again, controlled by automatic assessments. That's key. The automatic assessments. This is also prevalent in the first definition, but I really wanted to hone in on it in this second definition because we are constantly assessing people, assessing our situations all of the time, both in our awareness and outside of our awareness, or both consciously and unconsciously. And then finally, it refers to those attitudes. Remember, we just defined that, stereotypes that affect our understanding, that affects our actions, and yes, that affect our decisions in an unconscious manner. So think about this definition. So we're talking about our actions or judgments. We're talking about the attitudes and stereotypes that we have that impact how we understand other people, other groups of people. We're talking about how our attitudes, stereotypes, our actions and judgments impact our actions, And then here's a really critical one as well. We're talking about how those attitudes and stereotypes and stigma impact our decisions. Keep in mind that we make decisions in all facets of our lives, both personally and professionally, right? And so we do these things in an unconscious manner without even thinking about them. So that's the formal definition I wanted to share with everyone here this evening. Secondly, let's talk about the difference between explicit and implicit biases. So the primary difference is that explicit biases are very much in our consciousness. We are aware of our decisions. We are aware of the actions that we take. We are aware of our stereotypes, the stereotypes that we hold. We're aware of the stigma that we place upon other people and groups of people and communities. We're aware of those things. So implicit bias is all of those things, but they occur without conscious intent, which means that we're doing it without even knowing that we're doing it. And I have an example for each one. So these examples are this first one, the explicit bias. You know, I really do like the Granny Smith green apples versus red apples. I am conscious of the difference between the two based on my evaluations of them. One study that I read showed that university faculty are more likely to respond to those students with a stereotypically white-sounding name when responding to research opportunities. So, for instance, if a Nick, so to speak, and Nick, I hope, were to contact an instructor versus a Rashida, that faculty member is more likely to respond to Nick based simply on his name without even being aware that they're doing that. That's what an implicit bias is. And so we can talk about how, you know, Nick having that opportunity is outstanding and wonderful, but we have to also talk about how Rashida not getting those opportunities can lead to a whole plethora of issues for her, especially if she comes from a historically marginalized and oppressed community, okay? And we are going to talk about those things when we start talking about how implicit biases manifest within our society, within our systems, our institutions, and so forth. So, you know, this is the piece where it really gets jargony. I want to give you a forewarning. And this is where a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists really do a lot of research with regards to mental processing. It's not my area of expertise, so to speak, but I think this information is important because it helps us to differentiate between how our brain processes information implicitly and explicitly. So with regards to mental processing, there are two systems, right? And the first system is where our thoughts that occur outside of our awareness take place. So these are basically our unconscious thoughts, right? Decision-making operates automatically, effortlessly, and very, very, very quickly. it impacts how we perceive and act. So I'll give you an example. I was in the United States Air Force, and I had an opportunity to, I was in Saudi Arabia before 9/11, but after Khobar Towers. And me being a type A, very aware individual, just one of those types of weird kids growing up, I was always aware of a lot of different things. And so one day I was driving through Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, the capital, and I heard a loud bang, not driving through, I was walking through a bazaar where they sell these different things, like a festival, carnival type of deal. And a loud bang went off. I don't know what it was, but as soon as that bang went off, instantaneously, my automatic reaction was to take cover and to get very low to the ground, right? Because I was aware of what had happened at Khobar Towers. I was aware of all of these other things that had happened throughout the course of history with the United States military. And as a result of that, I was on edge. And as a result of that, I had made some prejudgments about things that might happen before they even happened. And in doing so, after being deployed, I was a little bit jumpy, and I was able to process information automatically. My training kicked in automatically. And a key part of this is that in thinking about getting low to the ground and taking cover, I did not assess or evaluate the decision to do so. I was very uncritical in my acceptance of the information that I'd received that caused me to react almost reflexively to that particular sound. And unfortunately, I'm still that way, y'all. I'm sorry. All right, so system 2 involves conscious processing. Of course, system 1 is the unconscious processing. System 2 involves conscious processing. Very intentional, requires careful and deliberate concentration for decision making. An example of this would be the mental tasks that we put into place for doing certain things, like changing a tire on a car. For me, I have 2 5-year-old twin boys, and so we were very meticulous in building this Saturn V rocket that we've worked on over the summer, and it involved very intentional and careful and deliberate concentration that we, all 3 of us, were aware of. So I wanted to share this piece because I think it's important that we understand how we process information and where we process information neurologically, okay? Is everyone still with me? Got a thumbs up, good, 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 good. All right, so let's move to discussing various characteristics of implicit biases, okay? Number 1, they are pervasive. We all have them. I repeat, we all possess biases. Even individuals who proclaim themselves champion of justice, fairness, and equality, they've got them too. Hopefully those individuals are aware enough to know that they have them so that they can do the work to mitigate them. All right, so number 1, they are pervasive. Number 2, they are related to explicit biases, but are distinctly different. However, our explicit biases can most assuredly reinforce our implicit biases and vice versa. All right, everybody still with me? Good. Some additional characteristics. So those that we hold don't necessarily match with our beliefs or reflect the stances that we take explicitly. So keep in mind that, if I am proclaiming through this presentation that I am an advocate for social justice and addressing issues within our school system, such as disproportionate discipline, but when I'm working in the school system, I actually facilitate disproportionate discipline, then there we have a discrepancy where I am potentially facilitating disproportionate discipline through my actions, through those stereotypes that I hold, through the stigma that I hold, all of those different things. And they don't necessarily match with the fact that I always introduce myself, or when I'm introducing myself in forums like this, where I am an advocate for students who are disproportionately impacted in discipline in school. So, and then finally, number 4, they tend to favor our own in-group, although we can still hold in-group biases as well. Okay, so that makes sense, right? The groups that we're part of, we tend to hold fewer negative implicit biases about, although we definitely can hold some about our in-groups as well, okay? Number 5, and this is a really important piece, they are malleable, meaning we can mold them, we can squash them, we can unlearn them through specific techniques and strategies. And this is where hope lies with regards to the negative impacts of implicit biases. Okay. All right, so we've defined implicit biases, right? We've described some of the characteristics of implicit biases. So now let's talk about what implicit biases can lead to. These are some very formal terms, but I think they're very, very important because it allows us to place a label on some of the things that we may witness in our everyday lives. It allows us to place a label on some of the things that we may engage in personally ourselves. And by knowing and understanding these labels, we can then work to mitigate those impacts again. And so that's why I've included this information. I apologize if it's a little bit dry, all right? But the first one, implicit biases can lead to misattribution. So this is when an individual attributes events or experiences, their events or experiences, to an incorrect cause. And I hear this one all the time. If you're on social media, you probably see it. If you even watch the mainstream media, you probably see it. An example of misattribution would be attributing criminal behavior to someone's race or ethnicity. So because someone is quote unquote Black, then they are more likely to be involved in criminal behavior. That is false. That is the name of that phenomena is misattribution. And what it does is it allows us to dig deeper, to understand why in some African-American communities, criminal behavior may be increased, but to dig deeper as to why that criminal behavior may be increased. It has nothing to do with the person's, with the amount of melanin in their skin, has everything to do with the socioeconomic situations, has everything to do with how their communities are policed, has everything to do with the education system and how adequate or inadequate it is, has everything to do with even holding on to hope for a better tomorrow, okay? And so once we understand that we're misattributing things, then we can work to undo them. The second, disambiguation. So this is when an individual is in a very ambiguous situation and they unconsciously make that situation clearer by relying on prejudices and stereotypes, all right? I have here an example, and you can read it, but I want to share one that might be a little, I don't know if it's funny. Hopefully my wife can't hear me because it's about her. So we used to live in Cincinnati, Ohio. And we, this was before we had the boys. And so one day we were riding through downtown Cincinnati. We were newbies, had no idea where we were going. We were just exploring, and we ended up in a really bad part of town. And we ended up coming to a little bit of a traffic jam, and there were people on the sidewalks and some people who were, in my eyes, I could see these individuals were, I'll use the word suffering from poverty, suffering from addiction, drug addiction, and some of those things. And so we came to this stoplight, and without any prompting, without any words spoken, the only noise that I heard was click. And it was the sound of every door in our car being locked. And I said, "Hun, why'd you lock the door?" I said, "You do realize you just locked the doors." She's like, "Oh, I didn't even notice. I just locked the door." I said, "Well, you probably like, why did you lock the door?" She said, "I don't know." I said, "Did it have anything to do with those people standing on the sidewalk who you're not familiar with, who we know?" Well, she's like, "Well, I don't know them. So yes, I'm locking my door." She's like, but what she was relying on were the unconscious stereotypes that she had developed growing up in Chicago. Whereas I'd grown up in a rural town in Alabama, hadn't seen, you know, and I've seen poor people all my life, you know, it was no big deal. And so her unconscious reaction to driving through a rough part of town with people who she deemed a potential threat was to unconsciously lock the doors in our car. Please don't tell her I told you all that. She hates when I tell that story. But that's what we're talking about with disambiguation. When we were in an ambiguous situation and she unconsciously made it clearer, safer for her by engaging in an action that was premised on her own prejudices and stereotypes. All right, I've got two more and we'll keep it moving, all right? What my time? Okay, we're good. Cognitive load depletion and causal pathways. As we are in the midst of additional summer 2020 social unrest with regards to police and Black men, these two are what I feel are at the root of many of the interactions where unarmed Black men have been killed by police. Cognitive load depletion. I worked as a firefighter in the United States Air Force, and I know that in an intense situation, you can be cognitively overloaded. And so when in situations that demand high cognitive resources, our brains will take shortcuts, mental shortcuts, like stereotypes, in order to help us to assess our situations or to process the information that we have before us. And so I can see sometimes some of our policemen having to use a lot of cognitive resources, and as a result can unconsciously default to stereotypes and biases that they hold that they do not know they even hold. Remember, we can hold implicit biases even though we say, you know, I don't have a racist bone in my body. I have Black friends, I have Asian friends, I have Hispanic friends. But when it boils down to a high cognitive load situation, our brains can take shortcuts to stereotypes that we aren't even aware that we still hold. And I think that's what happens in a lot of these interactions where Black men are implicitly deemed as more dangerous than any other population in this country. There's research that suggests that over in the legal studies and justice field, there's a lot of research on this that backs this up. The causal pathways is when our implicit biases influence how a person experiences the world, leading to their experiences reinforcing the implicit biases that they hold. For an example, a police officer associates crime with Latinx individuals, right? Making the officer more likely to view individuals from that community as criminal. This further reinforces whenever the whenever the officer encounters individuals from that particular ethnic community. And so remember these two, because I think this is where we are in our society, where we're not labeling what's going on in the most accurate way. And because I think as a society, I know that we still aren't ready to have these conversations in a broader context, in a national context. And these conversations would have to be led by leadership. And so we're not quite there yet, not quite there yet. Some additional terms, and I'm gonna pick up the pace here, that are definitely connected to, but aren't necessarily the causes of implicit biases, but microaggressions. Microaggressions are connected because they are very subtle in nature and they happen unconsciously. Microaggressions take place unconsciously as well. So they are a type of implicit bias that can manifest verbally, non-verbally, that can manifest through our actions, so forth and so on. These are the brief everyday exchanges that send denigrating messages to a target group like racial minorities, women, and those who identify as LGBT, right? I'll never forget when I moved to Ohio and I was meeting some of the faculty members at the university where I worked, and he said, "Oh, you're so articulate for someone from the South." And so they didn't say I was so articulate because I'm an African American male. It was excuse me, it was a dig on who I was as a Southerner, as opposed to even an African American man. And so I said, well, I've learned to turn it on and off throughout the years so that I can navigate the spaces that I need to navigate, which blew their mind because they weren't ready. I was trying to be snarky, and I hope it did come off as snarky. But it was an experience, all right? They happen every day, often very subtle, often only picked up by the individuals who are the target of them. Because the individual who engages in them, it often happens unconsciously. All right, so we have micro assaults. These are unintentional behaviors, comments that convey rudeness, insensitivity, so forth and so on. You know, y'all may remember this line from a particular leader in our country. They're all criminals, they're drug dealers, they're rapists. Those are specific assaults. Micro invalidations, these are verbal comments or behaviors that communicate very negative or dismissed psychological thoughts, feelings, or even one's reality. You know, something to the sense, well, you know, I don't think we should target minorities within our institution to diversify. We should hire the most qualified person, as if an individual from a minority group isn't qualified. Right? Those are micro invalidations. So let's take a quick pause, and I'll take a few questions if you have any, or even comments. I'll probably limit them to 3 so that I can get to this next phase and make sure that we get there. So Nick, if you don't mind helping me field some questions. All right.
I don't mind at all. So if you raise your hand in the chat box or in your participant box, I will call on you as I see you, or you can type your question in the chat box and I will go in order. So there's a raise hand function in Zoom.
Okay.
If anybody has a question, you can raise your hands virtually, because I can't see you because we're presenting. So use that raise hand function.
You know what? I think I can I stop the share real quick? Yeah, let's do that.
There you go. All right. So if you have a question, you can wave at the screen or put your hand up in the chat, or do you, Kathleen? Okay.
Yes, I do have a question, actually. Let me start my video again. I guess my question is, what do we do to start this conversation? Because I've been saying for ever since George Floyd and ever since that murder happened, I've been saying, you know, the conversation about Black Lives Matter, it needs to include a conversation about Black mental health, because, you know, even the incident that happened in the last year, go inside, please. Go inside, please. Go inside. That's why I have my video off. The conversation that we have, it has to include that. Like, there was a young man who was killed last year by the state police, young African-American man. The family had called, the police the day before, asked for a welfare check to be done. Then he gets pulled over by the police like 4 different times. He runs at he was speeding. He's, all kinds of motor vehicle violations. Finally runs out of gas. And when they approach him and they see he's run out of gas, they're going to give him a ride. And he says, well, I'm trying to get to the end of the video game. And then he gets into the driver's seat of the trooper car and they kill him. And I just think that there's a lack of education, because it's like we have this implicit bias, like mentally ill, the implicit bias is dangerous. And then it's like Black man mentally ill, then it's like double dangerous. So it's like, what do we do to try to, you know, change things?
Well, that's a great question, and there's no one answer to it, but I'll share my answer in this forum this evening. And one of the things we have to do is we have to find the courage to speak up. And when we do speak up, to speak up loudly, so that then we can bring along the willing to enact change. Well, change how? We have to educate the general public. We have to put pressure on our elected officials, and we have to engage in the actions at the personal level that models for others how we approach these particular issues. So not having a conversation at Thanksgiving dinner is not the way to deal with it. We have to understand that these conversations will be very difficult and that they will push us out of our comfort zones. And I would be the one to tell you that if you're having a conversation around this topic and you're not pushed out of your comfort zone, that you're missing a vital piece somewhere. Because in order to do this work, in order to make substantive change, we have to be pushed out of our comfort zones. And so through that process is how we're able to grow. I'm actually going to spill over into some of the information I'm going to share, but really it starts with us, the individual person. And then it starts to spread within our inner circles, meaning right within our homes. And then it starts to spread within our family circles, the family that lives with us, the family that lives, grandma, uncles, aunts, all of the above. And then it starts with our friends circles, having the courage to have these conversations when it is not the most politically correct conversation to have. That's where it starts. It really does. Because if you think about it, this country historically, we have not had a real reconciliation with regards to the issue of race, even though the issue of race is at the foundation of the country. The fact that you all are in Philadelphia, not lost on me, right? Yeah. So I hope that answers your question. In a general sense, hopefully some of the additional information that I share will give you a little bit more insight as I drill a little bit deeper as to what we can do. But A, find the courage, B, speak up and speak up loudly.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And Nathan is next. Nathan was kind enough to share this on Instagram too, so thank you, Nathan.
Yeah, no problem. Hi. So kind of building off what Kathleen was talking about, are there specific things that you should avoid saying? Because when you accuse someone of having unconscious biases, they tend to automatically go on the defensive because they don't want to feel like a horrible person. And they're not, because, you know, it's not their fault that they automatically resort to this, as long as, you know, they make an effort to change it once they've been made aware of it. So is there anything that, like, you should specifically avoid doing?
Yeah, you know, that's a great question. And I'll say what I would encourage you to specifically do is to, instead of pointing out someone else's implicit bias, to share with them yours. Because what that does is it allows you to demonstrate a level of humility, quote unquote, a cultural humility, that they can then observe and hopefully will grow to the point where they're able to acknowledge and identify their own implicit biases. Mm-hmm. What you've just described are what we call, our emotional roadblocks, where if you throw the word race on social media and all hell breaks loose, right? Talk about racism, discrimination, implicit biases, and people just retreat to their emotional reactions. And those emotional reactions are very real. We don't want to discount them, but we do have to acknowledge that they can be roadblocks to doing the work necessary to get us to the point where we can start to overcome those things being implicit bias, racism, oppression, inequity, injustice. Yes, that's the hardest part. It is the hardest part, is getting people to that point. And we're not going to get them by pointing fingers at them. But you know what? I can point the finger at myself and say, yep, I've got some biases and this is when they manifest. As a matter of fact, I've been thinking about them and I know what triggers them. Mm-hmm. I'm raising 2 black boys right now. And my fears for them, even though they aren't able to leave my home independently, I'm, trying to maintain years of life by not worrying about them and what could potentially happen to them in the next 13 years when they're 18 years old. Knowing that they don't have to be 18 years old because Tamir Rice was only 12 years old. So again, highlighting it yourself, starting with self, is how I would approach that. I hope that helps a little bit.
No, it really did. Thank you so much.
Good deal. You're welcome. All right.
That's all the hands I see, Dr. Crook, if you want to.
Perfect. We will keep it moving. Thank you all for your questions. And I hope that some of the answers made a little bit of sense to you.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so is it sharing now? Here we go. All right, so am I back on? All right, good deal.
Yes.
Good deal. All right, so here we are. So let's keep moving. We're at 8 o'clock, so we're doing pretty good. So where does implicit bias show up? You all would be surprised, and in many of these instances, you would not be surprised. They show up in the business world. They show up in the healthcare system, education, counseling. Yes, they show up in the military as well. Okay, so let's talk about them. Policing, the criminal justice system. And this is just information that I'm sharing. So I'm going to move really quickly because I want to make sure that we get to the strategies for reducing these implicit biases. Excuse me. Biases cause racially discriminatory decisions about who to investigate, meaning who to even stop or search, and how to interpret their behavior. Think about this. I come from a family where we talk with our hands, where our voices get, the volume of our voices go up when we're excited, when we're passionate. Think about someone from my family that I just shared with you interacting with an individual who comes from a cultural background where moving our hands and elevating our voices is seen as a threatening gesture or a combative posture, and how that can be interpreted based on one's biases or lack of cultural knowledge about that. It happens all the time. Prosecutorial discretion in charging. No, there are countless studies that indicate or that show African Americans are more likely to be processed and or charged for the same crimes as their white counterparts, even with weak or weaker evidence. The DA in a small town in Mississippi, I am very close friends with, and he won election back in about 2018. And as soon as he became DA, he is implementing an aspect of restorative justice that is specifically targeted towards mitigating and doing away with implicit bias in prosecutorial and in his discretion to prosecute individuals that come before him. He is very much aware of it. He's told me that he knows prosecutors who double down on their biases to rack up numbers or for whatever their more political ambitions may be. And so when you think about it, you think about individuals who do that stuff intentionally and unconsciously, and the impacts that it has on the individuals who are matriculating through the criminal justice system. And it's why we have disproportionate, a disproportionate number of African American men in our prison systems right now. Our juries even come to trial with, people try to say that justice is blind, and justice is not blind, y'all. It is not. We are people. We come to our places of work, our families, with all of our biases, our beliefs, our prejudgments. All of those things are part of who we are, including when we're called for jury duty. So juries, individuals can come to trial with beliefs and knowledge that influence decision-making. 90% favor a verdict prior to even deliberating. keeping in mind that biases also impact deliberations. I have reference here to a criminal sentencing study, and it shows that racial minorities are sentenced to longer, harsher sentences than their white counterparts for the same or lesser infractions within our criminal justice system. It is an area that is, I deem, in crisis. Okay, so let's talk about this. The healthcare system. So there's a lot of places where implicit biases can manifest, and I'm going to, again, because the personal is professional and the professional is personal. My wife recently my wife is battling currently breast cancer. It runs in her family. Her mother, grandmother, aunts, all have had breast cancer. And so she has been on high alert as she has come into middle adulthood. And she, as a result of that, she is very astute with regards to changes in her body. And she happened to come across some changes about 10 months ago. And she went to a physician to share what her issues were, and she had them dismissed. We said, no, we know the research, and we know that African-American women, African-Americans in general, have their concerns dismissed at a higher level than individuals from other backgrounds. So we went to another doctor. That doctor dismissed us as well, told her it was nothing. And then we found a third doctor, and it was after the third doctor, who happened to be an African-American female as well, completed her tests and examinations and things of that nature, that we found that she did indeed have breast cancer. My wife immediately opted for a full and complete mastectomy, which she just underwent this summer. And she just had a follow-up appointment where we learned that, as is the case for many African-American women, she had the most aggressive form of breast cancer, which means that had she not been adamant about advocating for herself, two physicians could have potentially led to her coming back home and sitting on this most aggressive form of breast cancer manifesting within her body. And so we are grateful for the level of discernment that she has worked with, and we are grateful for the ability to advocate for ourselves. And as a result of her experiences, she's starting, of course, a nonprofit to address specifically this particular issue with regards to African-American women and breast cancer. And so the healthcare system is where implicit bias manifests as well. There's another study about how pain medication is distributed less likely to racial minority individuals because of the implicit biases that physicians and nurse practitioners have towards those groups. Some of them very racist in nature, in that there's a belief among some, this study found that there was a belief among some healthcare providers that because those individuals were racial minorities, that they could endure pain at a greater rate. So we move from implicit biases to abject racist beliefs, because we know that every individual has varying degrees of pain tolerance, regardless of one's race or what have you. So yes, implicit bias manifests in our healthcare system. It manifests in our economic system, all right? Implicit bias contributes to minorities being scrutinized in their work more so than their white counterparts. It leads to lower evaluations, higher rates of termination, and ultimately higher rates of unemployment in comparison to the white workforce. So we always talk about how the unemployment numbers, and for racial minorities, specifically African Americans, there's always a higher unemployment rate. It has a lot to do with implicit biases and our experiences within the work environment. I'm specifically reading research now about how negative evaluations in education have pretty much led to a flattening and even decrease of racial minority teachers and educators in our public school systems, even though the student population is moving fast towards being a majority racial minority population within the public school system. So I've highlighted another, the resume study. There's a study where resumes will come across a person's desk, and so those resumes with minority sounding names were more likely to be tossed into file 13, the trash can, than those without racial or ethnic sounding names, even though those individuals may have had more experience, more education in those particular settings. And it happens all the times in a variety of professions. Excuse me. In education, we talk about various things. How does implicit bias manifest in education? Dominant discourse, the way educators think and talk about students and families, and how the way they think and talk about them actually underestimate, marginalizes, and even pathologizes them. Our mindsets and beliefs, how there are teachers who underestimate the intellectual capacity of students from diverse backgrounds, and girls too. I've worked as a school counselor, and I've seen school counselors intentionally and unintentionally guide our female students towards non-STEM related careers because they, for whatever reason, right? Even though those individuals showed promise in STEM related subjects. Disproportionality and discipline. I alluded to this earlier. And one of the things I wanted to share, this is what really, this particular research is what really got me. A few years ago, I was doing some research for an article that I was writing, and I came across this statistic that African-American students represent 42% of preschool suspensions, while they only comprise 18% of the preschool population. Yes, I said preschool. So we're talking about babies. So when we're talking about babies, we're not talking about kids who are engaged in these intentional actions and behaviors. We're talking about adults who are interpreting behaviors in ways that lead to this disproportionate suspension amongst preschoolers, that is, kids who are under the age of 5 years old. Once I read that, that's when I said to myself, I have to start raising a little bit of hell, because that was something that was so disturbing in so many ways that I cannot explain to you even here tonight, okay? Of course, if you work in education, you are familiar with how racial minority students are disproportionately sent into special education. We've seen an increase in English as second language students. This happens there as well. Even though those students may struggle, we know that they have gifts and promises in many other areas. However, the biases that teachers and administrators hold disproportionately pipe them into special education and even prison. So what about counseling? How does implicit bias impact us in the field of counseling? It can impact our body language as a counselor. It can impact our demeanor. It can impact our ability to interpret behaviors and emotions, and it can definitely increase the likelihood that we might microaggress. Why are these things important? They're important because we know that if you're working within the field of counseling, that the one factor that clients of counseling have identified that leads them to rate counseling as successful or not is the relationship that they have with the counselor. And so if an individual is able to build rapport, then they're able to build trust. If they're able to build trust, then they're able to build a strong therapeutic relationship, which is the one factor that clients have identified as the factor that of whether or not counseling was successful or not to them. And so if we aren't able to build that rapport, to build that strong therapeutic relationship because of the implicit biases that we hold, then it goes back to the first question that was asked about mental health. How are we then able to effectively practice as mental health practitioners? And the answer is we're not. And as a result of that, these historically marginalized groups don't receive the services they need and end up in our justice system. And in the case that was shared, unfortunately, it sounds like somebody was killed who had mental health issues also. So yes, so it definitely is important. Some other ways that implicit bias can impact our clients can be misdiagnosed or not diagnosed at all with regards to a mental health diagnoses. The literature clearly highlights that clients may terminate prematurely. An adversarial relationship will definitely not allow you to build a strong therapeutic relationship. And then the potential to reduce the coordination of comprehensive services that many individuals may need who may have co-occurring mental health disorders. Okay. So just know that implicit biases can impact students in their academic development, their personal and social development, and even in their career development. And this is specifically for school counselors. And I alluded to it when I talked about how girls specifically can be impacted with regards to how they're guided in their particular career and academic interests. Whereas research has shown that girls are disproportionately not guided towards STEM careers, even though these STEM careers are where many of our future professions will be, okay? For the sake of time, I've shared some experiences already, so I'm going to skip this piece and get to some strategies. All right, so this is what we're here for, right? All right, so Verna Myers, remember from our TED Talk, one of the things she goes on to talk about with regards to overcoming our biases is to walk boldly towards them. And so those few words are very, very loaded. What does walking boldly towards them mean? It means we first have to acknowledge that they exist. It means we first have to then go on to identify the ones that we may hold. And until you do that, there won't be any movement in reducing the implicit biases that we hold. We can't change what we won't first acknowledge, and we have to keep that at the forefront. All right, so let's talk about some strategies. And one of the things that I like to do, for those of you who may come from a counseling background, is I use the multicultural competence model, where the focus is on developing awareness, knowledge, and then engaging in action. Number one, we have to first increase our awareness of our own worldviews, okay? And then we have to increase our awareness of the worldviews of others, okay? So what do our worldviews entail? They are the beliefs that we hold, the values, the assumptions that we make, and yes, the biases that we hold as well. We have to increase our awareness of what we believe, of the biases that we hold, and then we have to learn about the worldviews of others. This is so important, so important. Secondly, we have to work to increase or obtain cultural knowledge, and then we'll talk about some ways you all might be able to do that. And I say you all, that's me included, because we know that this work is lifelong. There is no endpoint to it, okay? There is no one class or workshop you can attend that you can then be stamped culturally competent. That's not how it works. It is hopefully a process that we take with us until we leave this current existence that we're living in. And so we have to obtain the cultural knowledge. And then finally, this third part of this is we have to take action. We have to use our increased awareness and knowledge to improve our interactions with other folks. And then we have to advocate at the personal level, the community level, and at the societal level with regards to all of those issues that makes the greater United States uncomfortable. Issues of race, equity, social justice, injustice, all of those things. Yes, we have to advocate, and advocacy inherently involves taking action. All right. And so we'll talk about some of the ways that you might be able to advocate at the personal level, at the community level, and then also in the greater societal level as well. So keep that in mind with regards to your approach to reducing implicit bias. Work towards cultural competence, okay? Continuing the personal work, Senator Harris, I heard her say this, I think it was in a speech last week, where she said that there was no vaccine for racism. You have to do the work. You know, truer words were never spoken. This is exactly what has to happen. There is work that we all must engage in. And so we first have to understand that in working to enact change within our communities, to address the George Floyd situations or the situation that's currently going on in Wisconsin, we can't do anything about that until we first started working on ourselves, okay? After working on ourselves and increasing our awareness, we then have to intervene, and that's that action component, okay? All right, so increasing our awareness of our biases by learning to disrupt those automatic thoughts that we might hold. Ms. Myers alluded to this in her TED Talk, avoiding color blindness, right? When you hear someone say that they don't see color, that's an opening for a conversation. We absolutely see color both literally and figuratively, all right? So instead of avoiding or walking away from it, remember we have to walk boldly towards it. So when we say we do see color, what do we do then? Then we work towards identifying the differences that we may have. Then we work towards identifying the commonalities that we may have, okay? We do these things so that we can learn about one another. This is one way we increase our cultural knowledge. But then we have to understand how color directly impacts a person's experience in the justice system, in our economic system, in the education system, in our financial, I already said economic, but economic and financial systems as well. I just read a study maybe 2 days ago where a couple where the wife was African-American and the husband was white went to sell their home. And there's a lot of research showing where African-Americans who are looking to sell their homes are, devalued by a margin of anywhere from 20 to 25%, simply because they are Black people living in the home. And so what happened was they left all of their personal belongings in the house where it was evident that where it was evident that racial minorities lived in the home, and they got one estimate, and they felt that estimate was insulting and low. And so what happened, they cleared all of the personal items, and the husband remained in the home, and they got another, the same person, excuse me, not the same person, but another person to come evaluate their home, and it was evaluated at a rate of 20% higher than what it was with the other information that was included there. So again, it definitely, that in itself impacts economics. It impacts that family's wealth in a sense. And so that's how implicit bias can manifest as well. Take on the perspective of the out-group member. Put yourself in another situation. Put yourself in somebody else's shoes. There's a word for that. It's called to empathize, right? I worked in rural Alabama as a mental health counselor, and I worked with this kid, and he was getting beat up at school almost every week. And, you know, we were talking, and, you know, he had come in and he said, well, I said, well, tell me about what's going on before you get into these fights and you get beat up. He said, I said, well, what you know, are they doing things to you? Or he's like, no. He said, I typically will call them a name. And he's like, yeah, we'll exchange insults. I said, well, what type of names are you calling? So he was using racial epithets, the N-word. He was calling kids the N-word, and they were beating him up. And even though he was using that word and said, you know, I call them that, but I don't think that you're one, I was still able to empathize with that kid because I put myself in his shoes and thought to myself, you know, what must it feel like to think that the way I'm going to get ahead is by insulting these kids on a weekly basis by using the same derogatory terms to describe them. And they continue and to get the same result every single week, right? And by being able to do that, I could see past the words and honestly had concern for him and was able to help him throughout the course of our time together. So again, being able to take the perspective of the out-group member, all right? We have to diversify our personal and professional, quote unquote, meaningful and ongoing relationships, all right? The more genuine time we spend with individuals who are culturally dissimilar from ourselves, the less racial anxiety and biases are able to set up shop within us. Here in the South, and I'm making a generalized statement, there are not a lot of instances where individuals who are from culturally dissimilar backgrounds racially have dinner with one another. Think about this. What I've called, I call this method the breaking bread method. Where I'm from, when you break bread with people, it's a very intimate event. It's a very respectful, it's a very humble event where you are able to commune together, where you're able to respect one another, to build relationships in order to enhance your relationships. And so I was out here writing all this stuff about these different topics. And I told my wife, I said, hon, I say, you know, the only people we have over for dinner are people who look like us. And so we were intentional about the individuals, reaching out to individuals who were friends of ours, but who didn't look like us, to have them, to invite them into our homes to break bread together so that we could all learn from one another even more so than what we had. So we have to diversify our personal and professional, meaningful and ongoing relationships. We have to contrast negative stereotypes and counter them with positive ones. Verna Myers alluded to that as well when she described the Jeffrey Dahmer versus the Colin Powell exercise. We have to do more of that. Yes, all right. We have to integrate anti-bias ideas and procedures into our decision-making. Scott Colomb, who is in Columbus, Mississippi, is the DA there, and he has integrated procedures into his decision-making to reduce the impact of implicit bias in the judicial system there in that part of Mississippi, which is notorious for its negative impacts of implicit bias within the judicial system, okay? All right, so here's another piece, individuation training. Well, what in the world does that mean? All right. This is something that we can do in our homes. This is something we can do on the job with groups of people, with our book clubs. But this is where we learn, we work to learn and to teach others about people as individuals rather than as group members. All right? To teach and to learn about others as individuals as opposed to group members. All right? So here's something that some of you may have heard. You know, I can't be racist because I have a black friend. Actually, that's not a good indication of you being a non-racist, right? But what would be a good indication of you being a non-racist person who is able to mitigate or to do away with your implicit biases is to approach that individual as an individual. And so people are often thrown off when I say that I have friends, period. I don't have to put a label on my friends because they're my friends. They are individual people who I can separate from the group that they may be a part of here in the United States based on our demographic coding and so forth. All right. But again, learning to evaluate people as individuals rather than members of a group. You know, I have on a, you know, I even put on a blazer and a collared shirt here for this for this event tonight. But y'all, outside of formal events, you know, in the wintertime, I know Philly, y'all may know about this. I put on my Timbs and my hoodie, and you know, I'm and you would never know that I've been a professor for 10 years, right? And as a matter of fact, there are individuals out in the world who wouldn't know it either, because I cannot tell you how many times I've been approached for individuals looking to buy drugs from me in my neighborhood. Right? So those people weren't evaluating me based on the individual that I am because they didn't know me. They made decisions about me before ever getting to know me instead of learning who I was as an individual. All right. And then finally, this is a big one. We have to remind ourselves and others that majority group members aren't judged by the actions of one person. However, this is often the case in minority groups, right? My wife and I, we sit here and we'll hear about some horrific murder. And y'all, I'll be honest, sometimes we're praying, Lord, please don't let it be black. Please don't let it be a black person. Please don't. And we think about, well, why would we pray that? Because we know that we would also have to answer for the actions of that individual person. That's why. And so we do it in jest, but we do it because we are aware that oftentimes an individual within a minority group will often be the standard for the whole group, no matter what. It's the same thing in a class where a student from a culturally diverse background might be asked to speak on, tell us what Korean Americans think about this. Well, you know, well, hell, I don't know what Korean Americans think about it, but I know what I think about it should be the response, right? So that's what we need to remind ourselves. That's individuation training. It is something that we have to be cognizant of and can do so on a daily basis. Here is something that I've done some research on, and there's some YouTube videos. I won't share them for the sake of time, but there's been some remarkable virtual reality training in mitigating implicit bias. And one study from about 4 years ago found that white people who took on a black virtual body led to sustained reduction in the implicit racial biases that they held. There are some specific trainings that are popping up all over the place within the field of psychology and counseling, where they're actually holding virtual reality workshops where individuals can go to engage in this training. And as it continues to catch fire, I think it has the potential to being one way to supplement the personal work that we have to do to reduce our implicit biases. So if you've never had the opportunity to go into virtual reality and become someone else, it really can impact you in ways that you would probably be surprised. Because what happens is now people view you as what you look like virtually, and you then have to respond to your interactions based on your virtual self. And this particular study found significant reduction in racial implicit biases. So that's one. It's one where I'm hoping to do some additional training myself. Humility, and I put a star by it. The more convinced we are of how objective we are, the more likely biases are to creep in. And then I talk about meaningful relationships, having those friends and those colleagues from other cultural groups. But humility is important, and I want to focus on humility, or this phenomenon known as cultural humility. Cultural humility is others-oriented, right? It's others-oriented. And it is a stance to foster interpersonal respect amongst and between people. meaning that if you're a culturally humble person, if you're practicing cultural humility, then when you engage with other people, it is all about them. You're looking to learn, you're looking to experience what they experience by engaging in empathy, all right? And so that's one aspect of cultural humility, is that you are others oriented. It is a lifelong commitment, just like multicultural competence is a lifelong commitment, okay? It involves critical self-examination of those different factors of cultural competence that I highlighted. Cultural awareness, your motivation to learn from others who are culturally dissimilar. We have to engage in that critical self-examination. And then also, I hope you're noticing a theme between cultural competence. There's an action component, but cultural humility, there is an action component as well. And the actions that you engage in are very intentional, and they're geared towards equalizing relational and societal power imbalances. So that's really broad, right? It's really broad. Where are those relational and societal power imbalances? Well, they're in all of those professions or those institutions that I highlighted. They're in healthcare, they're in the finance and economic institutions, they're in education, they're in the helping professions, okay? And so if you're doing the work, then part of the work also involves getting involved within those entities, those systems, or those institutions to help bring about more equity and to help equalize those power imbalances. What that looks like is a whole nother presentation. It's another 2 hours worth of talking. All right. So it involves the ability to recognize how our own worldviews shape our interactions with those who are culturally dissimilar. I'll share this. My first time leaving the country was when I was deployed to Saudi Arabia. And during my deployment, I visited the countries of the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Oman. And because I have darker skin and I dressed as the native population, I was readily accepted, and wasn't rejected until they found out I didn't speak Arabic and had a southern drawl. But if I kept my mouth shut, I fit in. And so that experience of keeping my mouth shut, being humble while immersing myself, allowed me to gain a level of awareness that I don't think I would have ever gotten otherwise. It allowed me to see discrimination. I saw how women had to go to the back of a building to be served whatever food was being sold, and that stuck with me. At the time, women could not drive, and men would be the only ones driving cars as the children sat in the front seats and women sat in the back. That sat with me, and I said, wow, this is what real discrimination looks like within a different capacity. Because now that I've taken on my role with the traditional garb and my melanin content, I was able to see things from a different perspective. And that's what we have to do as individuals who want and who need to mitigate the impact of implicit bias, is to push ourselves out of our comfort zones, to engage in humility in a way that we're learning. Another aspect is understanding the influence of the broader context of our society that we live in here in the United States from a socio-historical perspective. Some of the stereotypes that people hold did not just pop up overnight. These things are deeply seated and have their roots prior to the founding of this country. Yeah. And so if you go embark upon this journey of cultural competence, of reducing implicit bias, of cultural humility, then it has to be parallel with learning the history of the United States. Okay? All of the history, not just the good, but also the bad. All right. So mindfulness, this is, this became popular, and I'm about to wrap up. This became popular over the last 10 years, but it has real implications for helping individuals who are looking to reduce the biases that they are aware of or that they want to become aware of, all right? mindfulness allows us to engage in increasing our awareness of the ability to control our responses to implicit biases once they're activated. And I'm trying to think of an example real quick. I remember one. So I was in the Air Force. I'd come back from the Middle East, and I played basketball with the Air Force for a while. Intramurally. I played basketball in college. So when you're playing pickup basketball, you get to pick your teams, right? And there were some white guys out there on the basketball court, and I was consciously not picking them. And then I thought to myself, you know, you just came from this experience overseas where you've seen these things, that's not right. And so I made a conscious effort, I was unconsciously not picking them. And then I had to make a conscious effort to pick the white guys who weren't being picked for basketball teams, all because of stereotypes and biases that I held. Yeah. Oh, don't y'all look at me like that. Y'all have got biases too. I'm aware of mine though. and I'm just picking right now, all right? So, but yes, and it's something that I remain aware of. And so being mindful of that by engaging in meditation, by reading the history. Meditation for me is prayer, all right? It allowed me to work towards reducing the actions that the actions taken that were influenced by the biases that I held. Okay. All right, I think I've only got a few more here. So Ms. Myers, she referenced this as well, the implicit bias study. I encourage you, I saw some people taking pictures of the screen. I encourage you to take a picture of this because self-assessment is important. If you want to start the process, take the implicit bias test that is still ongoing. There are a lot of people that's taken it. It is still, I've taken it twice. My default, I did prefer black. But, you know, I'm trying to think, you know, if I was conscious of I don't know. It has a lot to do with my own upbringing. But I was part of the 50% of black people who preferred black, all right? So I encourage you to start the process by taking this particular test. It is pretty cool. It's pretty neat, and it hopefully will be a catalyst for you to engage in additional self-assessment strategies, okay? I think the note taker that I shared also has a link to the test as well, all right? And then finally, diversity training, right? How many of you have sat through the stereotypical diversity training? Diversity training has, in some realms, has taken on a negative connotation. And I think it's taken on a negative connotation because of the approaches taken. I can tell you this, the diversity training that I engage in, people work. And people are typically left very upset, which is exactly how I wanted them to leave. Of course, being cognizant of not pushing some people too far and being able to handle them. I also teach, you know, multicultural counseling against the advice of, you know, senior level African-American professors who say, you teach that course and you teach it right, you're going to get some horrible evaluations. And so, of course, I took that as a challenge. And I still pushed my students, but I pushed them in a way that was healthy for them and that they understood was healthy for them to be able to engage in the profession of counseling in a competent way. Because all of them were there because they had a passion for helping people. Yeah, well, I say all, but most of my students, right? And so diversity training, make sure that the focus on appreciating differences rather than trying to eliminate differences. We walk boldly towards our differences. It should focus on fear reduction as opposed to ignoring the fact that people fear consciously and unconsciously. Activities that encourage more thinking about underlying reasons for stereotypes is needed, right? Right? There are a lot of people who have stereotypes and they don't want to think about how they got them. Well, they may have learned them from grandma or granddad, right? They may have learned them from a teacher or a scout leader or something like that. And that can be uncomfortable, thinking about, especially the people that we love dearly, having taught or shared with us both directly and indirectly these things that we now have. And so we have to engage in that. And diversity training should definitely push you towards that as well. Ineffective diversity training, it has these things about increased contact through immersion. That's not what diversity training should be about. That's something that an individual should embark upon in their own personal work. Okay? Diversity training should not train to suppress stereotypical, training to suppress stereotypical thinking triggers stereotypical thinking and the avoidance of target groups. So if we avoid these conversations, then what we're doing is we're avoiding the impact that the stereotypes that we subconsciously have can do to those targeted groups. Forced diversity training, I don't want anybody in my class who doesn't want to be there. Yeah. I did a presentation in Ohio, and a gentleman made a derogatory, it was about the school to prison pipeline, made a derogatory comment. And I said, and I welcomed him to leave. No harm, no foul, but he just wasn't ready, right? And I don't want him to be forced there. And he was forced because I think the presentation that I was sharing was on a track to receive a certificate in diversity. So he was there to check a list, and he wasn't ready for it, all right? So in summary, implicit biases are a universal condition, and they cannot be ignored in light of the impact that it has on our personal lives and within our society. I'm telling you right now that a lot of the police interactions that are going on with Black men and police have its roots in implicit biases. When I watched the video, and I forced myself to watch the video after promising not to watch another one. When I watched the video and I saw the reaction of the cop who shot the gentleman in the back 7 to 8 times, I knew then what it was. He inherently feared that individual and interpreted certain behaviors and actions in a way based on his inherent biases towards individuals from that person's background. Yeah. Every individual, every single individual must make a concerted effort to identify and to reduce the implicit biases in order to remove the barriers, increase access, reduce racism, xenophobia, homophobia, all of the phobias. You can reduce your implicit biases by first acknowledging and walking towards them, engaging in the personal work that we highlighted, and developing cultural humility, okay? So we are at 8:50. I went over and I do apologize. I hope something that I've shared here resonates with you to the point that it motivates or is a catalyst for you to engage in the work necessary to change our society. Because y'all, I'm about up to here with what's going on, and I don't know what else to do afterwards, right? Because before George Floyd, there were a series of Black men who had been killed extrajudiciously. Voices were being ignored. Experiences were being ignored. And while I think COVID-19 had something to do with us slowing down enough to actually see and hear, I saw us get into some of the same routines as time progressed over the summer. And then bam, here we are again with a guy with 7 bullets in his back, who thankfully is still alive. So with that being said, thank you for your time. I hope that, again, something that I shared resonates. I will open the floor to any questions, comments, concerns, or even gripes. I can take critical feedback as well.
Well, I think before we open it up, Dr. Crook, I just want to thank you so much for being here tonight and for speaking to us. I think that, I think one of the very cool things about NAMI is that no one is forced to be here. So, in all of our programs, so everyone is here because they want to be here. So,
awesome.
I know that for everyone who stayed on, that it was effective, and that we're videotaping this. So everybody who had to leave was asking me if it was going to be recorded, and I said yes. So
All right,
hopefully
awesome.
you liked it enough to watch it again too, because, you know, I mean, if you need to reference something, but also I don't think that a NAMI would be really complete without this kind of a workshop and a talk. So I just want to thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Of course, absolutely. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. So I'm going to switch it back to gallery view. I think you'll all see Dr. Crook large on the screen, but
Okay.
if you want to raise your hand, if you don't know how to do that in Zoom, by all means, just wave at the screen and I'll see you. And you can also comment in the chat to ask a question, or just unmute if you'd like and just start. And if we have multiple people at the same time, I'll handle that. Don't
Awesome.
worry. All right. I'm getting lots of thank yous in the chat, and they're coming directly to me. But Kathleen, go right ahead.
I was just going to say thank you for your call to action. I wanted to take action, and the part that I hadn't considered is that when you said the conversation has to be uncomfortable, and I always want to make everybody comfortable in the conversation, and I didn't think about pushing those boundaries, and so I'm going to do that. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that's what it takes. Is remember, there is no growth. It's like being forged, you know, a sword being forged in fire, right? It takes a beating, it's hammered, the heat is turned up, but once the finished product is done, we have, you know, an excellent tool to work with in that sword. And so that's the same thing with these topics, in that we have to push ourselves out of our comfort zones. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that insight.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. The other Kathleen. We have two Kathleens. Kathleen Campbell.
Okay.
About 20 years ago, NAMI, Bucks County, saw a need to improve responses from police. We researched and found a program called the Crisis Intervention Team training, and we participate in that. And that has been successful in reducing incarceration of people with mental illnesses, etc. Are there any programs for police that are effective? I mean, this is a 40-hour training for police. Bring people with mental illnesses who can talk to the police on a one-on-one basis without being in a crisis situation.
You cut out there just a little bit, and I think I missed an important part of your question. Could you repeat it for me just a moment?
Is there a similar program, training for police, that is effective, that we can advocate for?
With regards to implicit biases, what I would point you to the Kirwan Institute at The Ohio State University. They have an entire institute there that is devoted to training with regards to implicit biases. And I think that would be a good place to start if you're looking to make a suggestion or a referral to your local police departments. Yeah, so I would start there, the Kirwan Institute.
Do they do a lot of police training? Do they presently do a lot of police training?
I know they offer trainings. I'm not sure if it's specific to police departments.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Thank you.
I'm sorry I don't have specific information about them, but I do know they offer training specific to this topic.
Yeah. And I think, you know, CIT has been, you know, Kathleen was the one that worked with us. Kathleen is our former president, so large part due to her. So, I mean, lots of what we do, there wouldn't be a NAMI without Kathleen. But, you know, it's there's an interesting thing happening in Bucks County right now, and it's not, you know, people of color specifically are getting their mental health treatment in our jail. So, you know, as effective as CIT is, I think what Kathleen was asking too is like how that could be better, you know, how we could improve that.
I think with regards to mental health, I can't stress enough that the work that you all are doing, the importance of that work with regards to raising awareness and also teaching those who interact with the public in general things to recognize so that certain things aren't interpreted certain ways, because that in itself is a form of implicit bias training also. And so that education piece is key. And I know your organization has done a lot of work. I almost became the advisor for NAMI at my previous institution before someone else jumped to it, beat me to it. But there was a student chapter there. But they did work, and part of the work that they did was on educating various groups on campus about issues involving mental health. And I think any work that you can do in your communities is noble work, because it's directly related to and tied to implicit biases as well. Yeah.
I'm also a member of the NAMI of the Virgin Islands. And we had a training down there, and
oh, how nice.
I have a wonderful friend named Zena May from Alabama.
Okay.
And she's an incredible NAMI advocate in Alabama. And
Awesome.
she came down and helped me train people down there to do the family-to-family education program.
Okay.
So it's very nice.
Well, that sounds like a great assignment if you need any volunteers
Yeah.
in the future.
We'd be happy to come down.
Yes. I do have a question for you, Dr. Crook, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Are you familiar with Jane Elliott and her brown eye, blue eye study or workshop or whatever you want to call that? What do you think about that?
It is, I think it's awesome. It is one of those trainings that pushes people out of their comfort zones, remember? And any training that pushes people out of their comfort zones, any training that allows people to wear the shoes of another, and the other being groups that are oppressed or marginalized, I think is outstanding, or has the potential to be outstanding training. And so being familiar with Jane Elliott and her original study that I think she did without IRB approval back in the 70s with her kids, but she's replicated into more formal training. I just listened to a podcast with her on it last week, and she is still doing the work, and she's closing in on 90 plus years old. Yeah. But I think that the training that she does is spot on as one part of the training needed in continuing to reduce the impact of implicit biases and to reduce our reliance on those unconscious biases as well.
Yeah. I wonder how police would respond to that.
I'll be honest, I've been pushing it for everybody. Educators, having gone through similar types of training, they absolutely should go through that type of training. And there's a reason why some departments are avoiding it as well. Yeah, let's just be honest.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's difficult to watch. I watched several of them. I watched her one of the original trainings that she did with her elementary school kids. And then I watched her on talk shows, and then I watched one that she did at a university. It's hard to watch.
It is.
It really is. It's like I don't know. It's annoying to watch. It's a lot of things. I mean, it hits home. It really does. So
That's the type training we should be moving towards, more towards.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
The gut
And I know
wrenching. Yeah.
Lisa has a question too. Lisa, if I'll
Well, it's kind of geared to all this, but I was wondering, I know when you become a police officer, there's a lot of psychiatric tests. They interview your neighbors, and I mean, it's you know, it's a pretty hard to pass to become a police officer. But
That depends. That's not everywhere.
That's not everywhere?
No, it's not. No, it's in many places, all you need is a high school diploma and their 8-week training.
Okay.
Yeah,
Right.
so it varies.
But is there a test to find out if somebody is racist?
Ooh. Not to my knowledge.
No, well, I think there really should be.
Yeah, there
I
are.
mean, we got to eliminate, if we're going to eliminate this problem.
Well,
Okay. I mean, we can't go in the workforce and be racist. We can't, you know, I mean, people are racist. I'm not saying that. But when you're working with the public, there should be a test to see if these men and women are racist.
There should definitely be a higher standard with regards to, and part of, while I'm not familiar with an assessment that measures one's propensity for racism or not, there are plenty of assessments, of personality assessments, that can assess for different trends in one's personality that can be very, very helpful. However, police unions aren't necessarily keen on those things because of what can spike on those assessments that can potentially disqualify people for certain jobs or for certain jobs within police departments as well. Same for the United States military. They do not do, personality assessments for that very reason. In fact, I worked on an Air Force base where pilots were training, undergraduate pilot training, and when they were experiencing distress, they would go to the chaplain's office, because if they went to the mental health services offices, then there would be a record created on them and those potential mental health issues, which could then impact their ability to fly certain planes, get certain assignments. And so they wanted to avoid that at all costs. And that's going to be the same thing in our police departments and law enforcement as well. However, a chief or someone who is forward-thinking understands the value of this type of conversation, of these types of trainings, and would definitely encourage their current members to engage in it. It should be mandatory twice a year, every year, for individuals in law enforcement, is my take on it.
Right. How do you think we should combat the fear that the police officers have? Like, how do you combat fear?
Education.
Like, just like you said, that gentleman, that was fear. That's why he shot that man 7 times. And I saw that too. Like, why would you shoot somebody 7 times in front of their kids? Like, he could have killed other people too. Like, that was, you know?
And in the back, no less, which is really disturbing. So how do you do that? You must engage in some of the things that I just shared, the individuation training, the virtual reality training. They must engage in the personal work that's necessary. I guarantee you those individuals haven't had this type of a conversation in their home with their significant others and kids, because that's where it starts. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's where
it should start before you're a police officer. I think that's one of the things we should insist on. Not to defund the police, but to insist on more training and to have better equipped police officers that are not biased or not prejudiced. You know, you're working with the public, and you can't, you have to deal with, I mean, today you're going to have to deal with all kinds of situations.
It speaks to the core issue. My expertise is not in law enforcement, but you don't have to be in law enforcement to know that every individual person whose job requires them to have high interactions with the public and people should engage in whatever training necessary to mitigate biases that they may hold towards the people that they're there to protect and serve, as opposed to policing.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And until we have that real discussion at the local level, all the way up to the highest office of the land, nothing is going to change substantively. So it doesn't matter if it's a police, it doesn't matter if it's a teacher teaching kindergarten, because it manifests there as well, remember? It manifests in healthcare with our physicians, remember?
Yeah, yeah.
So, you know, so not only the police, but everywhere. And I think the issue is that as a country, we haven't gotten to the point yet, even though we're, 50 plus years outside of the civil rights movement, to where we can have an honest, open dialogue about issues of race and these types of issues in a manner that moves us forward once and for all.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons we can is because of those emotional roadblocks. Emotional roadblocks is when someone says race, it automatically what? Defensiveness. Someone says race, automatic feelings of guilt. Those are real feelings. The issue is we can't stay there. We have to move through them to have these difficult conversations. Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Lisa.
Okay.
All right, and Nathan, go right ahead, my friend.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you real fast. I have some online coursework that I need to do, so I'm going to have to head out here. But thank you. I think there's a lack of a strong centripetal force in society right now. There's so many things that are tearing us apart, but there's like nothing really big that's bringing us together. So I just wanted to thank you for providing that. Thank NAMI for providing that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Nathan, and my thanks to NAMI as well, because anytime I have the opportunity to have these conversations, it is that move towards bringing us together, Nathan. So you're absolutely right. And the only thing I would encourage you to do is to have this conversation with your friends and family as well, leaving here.
All right. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Nathan.
Take care.
Absolutely, you too. Yeah, we can't advocate for mental health unless we have this discussion too with it.
Exactly.
So it's important.
Exactly.
All right.
All right.
If we have any other questions, one more question maybe before we close? If not, all right.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. I appreciate the opportunity. Again, all the best to you. Be brave, speak up, and speak loudly.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you all. Take care. Thank you again,
Dr.
Nick.
Crook. Thank you.